So as he's winding up, he's kind of just asking the general question of where do we go now? Competitive capitalism, which is what we saw at the beginning with the US, was long ago rendered obsolete through some of the things that violated the perfect competitive world that they seem to be operating in. Things like externalities, economies of scale, as businesses got larger. And then we see a variety of other capitalisms that have been tried in different countries at different times. And what we see is as we come up into the time period where globalization is rising, whatever type of capitalism they had did seem to fall to the force of globalization. Japan and France had a planned capitalism, but the act of planning was challenged because there were certain global forces they couldn't control, and so they had to give up a system that they may otherwise not wanted to let go. Germany had an organized capitalism, but it lost out because it was not attractive to investors. So even though, again, it might be something that they were happy with, it essentially was losing out to these globalization forces in the form of investment. You can look at Sweden and France. They had similar problems with keeping foreign investment out. And if you look at the US with the regulated capitalism, it raised the cost of production and that caused a loss in competitive advantage, and so a need to give up on that and move on to another system. And then Russia's state capitalism is certainly at this time period mired in corruption. China's success so far might be more due to the transition into industrialization rather than their actual state capitalism system. So we look at these various types of capitalism. Where do we go now? So to quote Clark, given the dysfunction of current economic systems around the globe, what institutional reforms could lead to a new system capable of securing the potential benefits of globalization while minimizing its potential weaknesses? So he basically offers these three things. We'll talk about each one briefly as we wrap up this chapter. With revitalizing communities, what Clark is acknowledging is their essential role in creating social and cultural capital. How important they are for the success of any economic system is to have a strong community. And the other thing he's acknowledging is that communities are essentially a public good, which means they have a free rider problem, which is discouraging individuals contributing either their money or their time to community revitalization. And so all five of these solutions here are basically different ways to get funds pooled together that can then be invested into the community. So we can look at something like the labor capital partnership, which could be in the form of enterprises and where workers and owners of capital hold shares of stock and receive dividends. Maybe something with the sovereign wealth fund. That would be wealth that is in a government-owned fund. Norway has a big one that they have from all the oil that they have in their country. They have a big fund there, and then that can be used for various ways to support the community. Like in Alaska, there's no state income tax for the same reason. The government is financed by the Alaska Permanent Fund, and in fact, they even get a dividend each year. And then all these others are just different ways to get money in the hands of, or to get money pooled together so that then you can overcome that free rider problem. So one of the challenges facing countries because of globalization is pressure to change or lower their standards to be competitive. And so that's called the low road, the race to the bottom, where you could gain a competitive advantage by reducing your production costs by lowering maybe some of the policies you have in your country regarding wages and taxes, regulations, that sort of thing. However, if you lower taxes, then maybe you can't provide some of the services that you would otherwise do. The high road would be the race to the top. You actually gain competitive advantage by improving productivity, that you're actually, as a government in a system are actually putting money into developing human capital, physical and social infrastructure, putting money into research and development, doing things to promote a healthy environment. So with this case, the high road is actually going to improve the productivity of the labor by improving their skill level, encouraging technological innovation, all these sorts of things, and that's how you will get your competitive advantage. The problem is the high road is partially blocked because we are in an unregulated global competition environment. And so if we could deal with that issue, then that might allow more countries to take the high road. But if you're unable to gather enough tax revenue to fund the needed public goods, then you're not going to be able to find yourself being able to take the high road. And there's just increased opportunity for defection for corporations to move to less regulated countries. And so this is why, in addition to strengthening communities and strengthening nations, he says it's actually necessary to have some sort of global standards. And so that's why he's arguing we actually need to have some sort of global standards. That's what he means by regulating the global economy. So he says if you look back at the success of the countries post-World War II, a lot of their growth has come from, depending whatever kind of system they had, but it came from some sort of creation of political institutions that both restrained and supported the market. But the market, whatever these institution restraints were on it, were domestic, and the market has essentially escaped those institutional constraints by going global. The global market is essentially more powerful than any single national government. And so that is why he's making the argument you need some sort of global governance necessary to solve what is essentially global collective action problems. And that it's often political opposition to the loss of sovereignty that stops this, because people don't want to give up some national sovereignty to some global institution. And so the question really is, how do you solve global collective action problems? In a way, the only way to solve a collective action problem is to be able to penalize free riders. But you have to do all of that while minimizing the loss of sovereignty concerns. So one thing Clark suggests is publicizing socially irresponsible and opportunistic corporate behavior. And that way consumers can essentially vote with their own dollars. If they hear someone is not acting in a beneficial way, they could choose to buy from someone else. Now, it sounds good, but how do you get all this information to publicize in the first place? And then will consumers actually vote with their dollars? It'll be like, well, I don't have the money for it. I'll let somebody else do that. I need to get this at the cheapest price possible. So making it mandatory provision of full information concerning corporate behavior. Okay, so we can make it mandatory. That deals with the problem of getting the full information. But, what are the standards that we now say is good and anything worse is, a violation? And then what do we do if you do violate it? Is there any sort of sanction we can do to penalize you for being opportunistic and defecting in that way from the standard? So all of this essentially means that you need nations to cede a degree of sovereignty in order for an international governing body to establish these sort of standards. And these are all his ideas, I'm just telling you. I'm not sure there's any chance of any of this ever really happening. I think a lot of what you see in the EU right now with Brexit, etc., is this tug of war between national sovereignty and ceding some of your sovereignty to an international governing body. And in the case of Brexit, they decided to take it back. But to wrap up, what Clark wants us to leave with is these three ideas: that strong communities, the reason we needed to revitalize communities is that strong communities foster the trust and civic virtues essential to cooperative problem solving by both national and global governments. We've got to have strong communities. Strong states will pursue the high road and thus provide the infrastructure and funding needed to revitalize the communities and strengthen the national economies. And then we need global governance to create uniformity in regulation, taxation, and protection of human rights. And then all nations will be able to take the high road. So with this plan magically installed, we would be able to enjoy more of the benefits of globalization and not have to deal with so many of the negatives.